Great. So I'm going to start introducing Kira, and yeah, and then we're going to pass over. And I'm sure that people are going to continue trickling in, but they will find their way. So Sa-Kiera is a recent doctoral grad student from Harvard. So she did a BA in biology and psychology from Williams College. She then went as a lab manager to UCL and then did her PhD at Harvard, where I was lucky enough to meet her. So Kira's work is mostly around the psychological and biological roots of power, hierarchies, and how these intersect to influence experiences and perceptions. And she's also studying social dominance and social hierarchies. I've really enjoyed following Kira's work because it's so timely and relevant and important and methodologically robust. But I think she also really combines this with such a warm personality and this kind of burning passion for social justice that comes through not just in her work, but in her daily life and the way that she approaches her academic work. So I'm personally really excited that we've got Kira here today. I'm really looking forward to the talk. So I'm going to pass over. So Kira, just take us away. Thank you.
Okay, that was one of the warmest introductions ever. So thank you. Let's see. Are you able to just see my slides? Yes, excellent. Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me. I have a feeling I was just telling Jim this, I'll be a little farther afield outside of most moral psychology, but I hope that you can see some streams of morality in what I want to discuss with all of you today. So today I'm going to do a talk I don't usually do because this is a theoretical model actually that I've been playing around with for a bit that tries to model under what circumstances people engage in intergroup harm. And so, like I said, this is one of the first times I'm presenting this. So I'm like really keen on feedback. And I guess as, George Bach says, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so my goal is to develop a useful model for understanding intergroup harm. And before I get started, I just want to pause and thank my advisors and collaborators on this work, including the late Jim Sedanius, Jennifer Richardson, who's my postdoctoral advisor, and Mina Cikara, who's like been in my corner since feels like day one. And that's also where I met Jim. So all good times. So I've just really appreciated their support and they've been helping me develop this. So here goes nothing. So I don't know, given that this is an international audience, I'm not actually sure if everyone knows who this is, but this is George Perry Floyd Jr. And on Memorial Day of last year, Floyd was killed during arrest after a store clerk alleged that he passed a counterfeit $20 bill in Minneapolis in the United States. And Derek Chauvin, who was one of the 4 police officers who arrived on the scene, knelt on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, while Floyd begged for his life, called out for his mama, and ultimately died due to suffocation. Now, his death became a catalyzing moment, really sparking social protests all across the world. So polls done over the summer estimated that somewhere between 6 to 10% of the adult population in the United States participated, which would mean that 15 to 26 million people protested during this time. So what you're seeing in this video are the locations for all the Black Lives Matter protests that happened on a single day, which was June 6th of 2020, which saw nearly 550 simultaneous protests. And there are many factors that made George Floyd's death such a catalyzing moment. One of them included the fact that his entire death was recorded and the video was widely shared, which is why I'm able to say it took 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Now, watching Floyd perish in this brutal manner was intensely painful, and many people indicated that they too felt like they couldn't breathe while they were watching. So in other words, by watching the video of Floyd's death, people were feeling intense empathy for Floyd and subsequently Black Americans and victims of police brutality more generally. Now, while expressions of empathy were the modal responses to Floyd's murder, a decidedly different reaction emerged in a small yet not insignificant number of Americans. Several police officers were reprimanded for making light of the way that George Floyd and other victims of police violence have died. Now, it wasn't just police officers, as regular citizens did this too. So people took pictures and videos of one another performatively kneeling on each other's necks, smiling and laughing as they simulated the murder of George Floyd. And so many of these participants of these almost cosplay events willingly posted their pictures and videos on Facebook and other social media sites, presumably for the entertainment and enjoyment of the members of their social network. And in fact, this last photo was taken January 6th of this year at the riot that happened on the Capitol as part of the protests of the people who went to, to deal with the fact that they thought that the election was stolen. They reenacted Floyd's death on the steps. So this is not new, right? So there are many instances in American history of such callous disregard for the suffering of another group. And so to me, these performative reenactments are reminiscent of the then commonplace practice of white people to photograph themselves with the dead bodies of Black lynching victims. Now, it is at least sometime in the morning for some people. I'm not trying to victimize or scar anybody. So I cropped this photo, but just off to the side are images of two Black men who were lynched at the time. Now, people would actually take these photographs and turn them into postcards. They would send, hey, Bill, how am I doing? This is what I'm up to, with the bodies of Black lynching victims on the front of such cards. Now, this is also not just an American thing, right? So in World War II, German soldiers kept what were called trophy photos, photos that showed the cruel tortures that they inflicted upon Jewish individuals. And I'm sure that people reflecting on these instances in isolation would say that these types of behaviors are in the past, and yet in 2021, we're still seeing them. So how can we make sense of these types of antisocial behaviors, right? Certainly these behaviors cannot be explained by a mere lack of empathy for outgroup victims of violence. Such behaviors reveal delight, if not outright joy, in the suffering of these outgroups. So to me, this is a clear sense of schadenfreude, or feeling positive feelings in response to the pain of others. So we exist in a world where, in response to the same misfortune and travesty, it can lead to wildly different behavioral responses. So the question that I have is, what are the psychological processes that gets us to this divergence? And so today, what I'm going to do is walk you through a model that I'm developing with Dr. Richardson and Dr. Amina Cikara as one way to understand these processes. So I'm going to show you the model, and then I'm going to show you my dissertation work that sort of was the backstory to building this model. So I guess I'm doing some things in reverse. Okay. So as I said, I'm excited for any all feedback on the model, as well as like next steps that you would take. And here's where use the Q&A in like real life as you're like, what the heck just happened? So that our discussion is pretty robust. Okay. So at the center of this model are emotions. So as we know, emotions are powerful predictors of intergroup behavior and can often be stronger predictors than attitudes alone. And one of the most well-studied emotions in intergroup contexts is empathy. Now, while empathy is a multifaceted concept, here I am interested in the affective component of intergroup empathy, defined as the extent to which a person feels an emotional reaction that is congruent with the emotion another person from a different group is likely to be experiencing, either due to a specific event or circumstance. So in the case of a group misfortune, such as George Floyd's death, the more individuals felt the collective sadness and pain that Black Americans felt in the face of police violence, the more empathy they likely felt. Like that is them feeling empathy. Now, there's a reason why empathy is so well studied in intergroup conflict and resolution. So individuals are less likely to feel empathy for those that they don't consider an in-group, but feeling empathy is related to a number of prosocial behaviors, such as donating time and money to people in need. And empathy can also lead people to engage in more costly altruism, meaning being willing to incur a personal cost in order to help people of another group. So for example, refusing to administer shocks to another person despite knowingly incurring a personal cost, or perhaps risking COVID-19 to protest police brutality last summer. So thus, many interventions aimed at reducing intergroup conflict focus on increasing the amount of empathy people feel towards outgroup members, which then can increase the tendency to engage in more prosocial behaviors. We know, though, that intergroup conflict is not just maintained by people not helping one another. It's also maintained by actual outgroup harm. Behaviors such as active subjugation, dehumanization, genocide, these like more active forms of intergroup violence. Now, if empathy was the full story, we would expect that feeling outgroup empathy would simultaneously produce an increase in outgroup help and a decrease in outgroup harm. However, there's a surprisingly small correlation between feeling empathy and engaging in aggressive behaviors in general, suggesting that the lack of empathy is not necessarily sufficient for intergroup violence, but it does seem sufficient for like general intergroup avoidance and neglect. So if there is a negative correlation, it's likely weak. So now the question is, well, so then what really is the driver of this more like outgroup harm if it's not empathy? And I'm sure y'all probably know where I'm going with all this because hopefully my introduction set me up well. So in situations of violent and often protracted intergroup conflict, not only do individuals fail to adopt the emotional responses of relevant outgroup members, they often adopt the opposite response. In other words, they feel counter-empathy. Now, we are defining counter-empathy to be the emotional response that is incongruent and opposite that felt by another individual. Now, there are two types of counter-empathy. You can feel schadenfreude, or feeling positively in response to another person's pain, or Glückschmerz, feeling negatively about another person's pleasure or fortune. Now, we had to go to Germany to find those words, and I'm not German, so I apologize if I butchered that pronunciation. Now, for this model, because we're focusing on outgroup misfortune, we're actually now going to focus on schadenfreude because that is the counter-empathic emotion in response to another group's misfortune. So engaging in intergroup outcomes that deliberately harm outgroups through acts of commission, active hate, and subjugation likely requires not only the absence of empathy, but also the presence of antipathy or schadenfreude. And so, feeling schadenfreude also does impede helping outgroups. It doesn't just facilitating outgroup harm. And just to tell you a little bit more about schadenfreude, because I actually think it's a fascinating emotion, it is really nasty, right? It is spiteful, and it's especially felt in competitive settings. So people have been found to experience schadenfreude in response to the suffering of romantic rivals, high status individuals, rival sports teams, even novel competitive outgroup members. More importantly, intergroup schadenfreude has been found to restore self-esteem and rebalance feelings of group inferiority in the wake of perceived threats to the in-group. So in this way, schadenfreude acts almost like a social functional dominance regulator, right? It's employed or deployed in order to diminish the perceived dominance and thus the perceived threat of its targets. And you can kind of see why, if schadenfreude works in this way, that it sort of leads to outgroup harm, and why empathy doesn't necessarily do that. It's connected to pro-social behaviors, but not necessarily the harm. Okay, so hopefully all of this is making sense thus far. Now the question is, what leads people to feel these emotions or not? Now, while there's a lot of literature out there, what I was doing with Dr. Richardson is sort of synthesizing across all of this work. And what we came up with is that it seems like perceived group threat and the context and the individual differences that increase its perception is a powerful antecedent to intergroup emotions in general and empathy and schadenfreude specifically. And so not surprising, I think, with everything that I've mentioned thus far, the more that an individual perceives a group threat, the less likely they will feel empathy, and the more likely they will feel schadenfreude in response to an outgroup member's misfortune, leading to engagement in these different behaviors. Okay. So going back to our opening example, while the outgroup misfortune again was the same, another Black person falling victim to police brutality, it is likely that the individuals who reacted with relatively high levels of empathy felt less threat than those who felt schadenfreude. Okay, so now the last part of this model outlines the context and the individual differences that exacerbate or perhaps mitigate perceived group threat. Now, if we're first looking at the contextual factors, there are many contextual factors that could matter, but the ones I'm going to highlight here are the presence of competition, unstable hierarchies, and sort of changing group size. So for example, in competitive settings, sort of perceiving an in-group threat can actually lead group members to feel reduced levels of empathy and increased levels of schadenfreude towards competitive outgroups in both racial and novel settings. And the ongoing work, I think, on shifting demographics in America, as well as abroad, well, at least abroad for me, simultaneously supports the relevance of stable versus unstable hierarchies and dynamic group size in perceiving threats. So at least reminding white Americans of shifting racial demographics in America actually leads them to perceive more racial group threat, which then in turn leads to expression of more negative emotions and attitudes towards racial minorities. Now, no studies that we are aware of has sort of connected shifting demographics with empathy and schadenfreude specifically, but they have been linked to other emotions like anger or fear. And I just want to note that perceived group threat not only reduces the levels of these emotions, but also influences individuals' motivation to feel these emotions in the first place, sort of adding more evidence to suggest that contexts really influence these emotions. Okay. Now, the final piece of this model includes individual difference measures that can exacerbate people's tendency to perceive a group threat in general or exacerbate in a threatening intergroup context. And so I'm going to highlight two here, and probably if anyone knows my background, the last one is not a surprise. So the first one is group identification. So people with relatively higher levels of group ID are more likely to feel threatened in situations that engender group threat, not surprisingly, but they're also more motivated to respond to group threats if they really feel a sense of connection with the group. And so there's also been plenty of research connecting group identification with increased levels of schadenfreude in competitive settings. And the second individual difference measure is social dominance orientation, or SDO. And I'm actually going to tell you a little bit more about SDO on the subsequent slides. So in my dissertation work, and this is the work that I'm going to show you some like cool numbers, hopefully, I investigated the role of one individual difference variable, SDO, and its impact on feeling empathy and schadenfreude, as well as support for different types of harmful policies. So that's what I'm going to do in this next section. I'm going to walk you through some empirical evidence to support this model and why I think this model might actually be a useful way of understanding intergroup harm. So just to give you a little bit more background on SDO and why it might be useful to study in the context of intergroup conflict, social dominance orientation, or SDO, is the ideological concept in social dominance theory, which offers an explanation as to why hierarchies are ubiquitous in human societies, as well as the forces that maintain them. And so SDO measures the extent to which people accept and promote group-based inequality. So people with relatively higher levels of SDO, and I'm going to refer to them as social dominants for the rest of the talk, they care about maintaining a current social hierarchy and believe that some social groups should be at the top and others at the bottom. So even with that definition alone, you can see why SDO is useful to study in intergroup conflicts where oftentimes people have strong views around my group, or there are certain groups that should be higher status, should have more power. And when people are fighting over these things, people's general ideological frameworks of how the world should be matters. Now, SDO is assessed by measuring people's agreements to statements that are very face valid, almost too face valid, depending on who you talk to. Statements like an ideal society requires some groups be on the top and others should be at the bottom. Very straightforward. Or group equality should not be our primary goal. And so what do we know about SDO, empathy, and counter-empathy? So to date, the work on SDO and these emotions have primarily invested only empathy and only empathy as a trait, meaning people's broad tendencies to have empathic concern for others or to engage in general perspective taking. So if you look at that work, what you'll see is that social dominants, maybe not surprisingly, tend to have lower trait empathy scores. So for example, in 2 longitudinal studies with a combined sample of over 5,000 participants, my old advisor, Jim Sedanius, and his colleagues found that SDO at time 1 negatively predicted empathic concern, at time 2 controlling for levels of SDO. Now you might be wondering if there's like a bi-directional relationship between SDO and empathy. And if you are wondering that, that's true. There is a bidirectional relationship, although going from SDO to empathic concern is stronger than the empathic concern to SDO pathway. So in other work using structural equation modeling, the correlation between SDO and trait empathy can be as high as negative 0.5. However, there's no research that I'm aware of outside of this work connecting SDO and counter empathy, which is kind of surprising because I mentioned that counter empathy really comes out in competitive settings. And one characteristic of SDO is that people see the world in a competitive light, a dog eat dog world. And so really this seems like these are 2 ill-fated lovers that have not crossed paths in the research lands. And so this work is really trying to bring these 2 things together that really should connect, but people haven't connected them yet. And furthermore, there was only a single study on STO and state empathy when we started this work. Now, investigating the relationship between empathy and STO in the moment is important because trait empathy, although like relevant, doesn't adequately motivate the types of intergroup behaviors and cognitions that I at least care about. So although people might have a general tendency to feel empathy or not, that doesn't guarantee that they'll feel empathy in the moment or to all targets. And both empathy and counter empathy are influenced by group membership, the very things that matter in intergroup conflict. Okay, so in study one, we wanted to do sort of like all these different concepts are happening. It's like, let's put them all together and let's investigate just the basic relationships between empathy, counter empathy, and SDO in an intergroup context. And so this is what we did. So we recruited white MTurk participants and told them that they would read experiences about different groups of people. And I think most people here know, but MTurkers are people who do surveys online for money. And so they're not nationally representative, they are a convenient sample. And so in this study, participants filled out a symbolic threat scale before completing a state empathy task that I'm going to describe to you in just a moment. And the reason why they filled out a symbolic threat scale before they did the task is because I wanted to reframe race relationships in a competitive way for these white participants. So what it did was reminded these white participants that ethnic minorities can pose a threat to their resources. And so some sample items includes, ethnic minorities are a danger to everything that is good, normal, moral, and decent in society, which is probably one of the strongest statements I've ever read. We did replicate this study with actually a realistic threat, but at the end of the day, the goal was not to actually care what people's responses were on this scale, but to really just get them thinking about intergroup dynamics in a more like dog-eat-dog way. And so after the state empathy task, participants filled out the SDO scale and were debriefed. So let me tell you about the state empathy task. So on a given trial in this task, participants saw a person and a story. So this is George, and George stubbed his toe. These stories were either mildly negative, as in this example, or mildly positive. So this could have also been Jack, and Jack won a bet. So we asked participants to indicate how good and how bad this story made them feel on 100-point sliders. And this constitutes our measure of participants' empathy and counter empathy. To make this an intergroup task, again, all of the participants in this study were white, but they responded to stories about white, Asian, and Black men. In the Q&A, you can ask me, why men? You can also ask me what happens if the stories aren't so mild. We did run a version where the stories are a little more intense, like Jack lost his arm in a accident. So to analyze the data in this study, we used a multi-level hierarchical regression model where feeling ratings, so participants' movement on those sliders, were predicted by event valence, whether the story was positive or negative, rating task, or how good or how bad did the story make them feel, the target's race, and SDO. And I just want to highlight that the interaction between event valence and rating task is what gives us these like different discrete emotions that I've been talking about. So for example, answering how bad I feel about a negative event that happened to someone else is me feeling empathy, or more specifically negative empathy, while feeling good about that same negative event is me feeling schadenfreude. So there is an emotion here listed that I haven't actually talked about, which is positive empathy. So going back to our definition of empathy, which is a congruent emotional reaction, empathy is not only how bad people feel when negative events happen to others, but also how good we feel when others experience positive events. And so that is what positive empathy is all about. Okay, so I had one main hypothesis. Is the relationship between SDO empathy and counter empathy sensitive to group dynamics? What we expected was people with relatively high levels of SDO or social dominance will feel even less empathy and even more counter empathy towards outgroup targets compared to in-group targets. Let's see what we find. So to show this relationship, what I'm going to do is plot each emotion in a separate panel label up top. So we have negative empathy, positive empathy, schadenfreude, and Glücksschmerz. And the x-axis is SDO. So the lines here represent the relationship between SDO and a given emotion for a particular race. So the light gray line show the relationship for Asian targets, long dashed gray lines for Black targets, and short dashed Black lines for white targets. And the y-axis is how much of this emotion are people feeling. So there was support for my hypothesis for empathy. So SDO did not significantly relate to either positive or negative empathy for white in-group targets, but was negatively related to both kinds of empathy for Black and Asian targets. Furthermore, the relationship between SDO and empathy was significantly stronger for Black targets than it was for white targets. That was sort of true for Asian targets. It was true before we controlled for multiple comparisons. Now, race also moderated SDO's relationship with schadenfreude. As SDO increased, you can see participants felt more schadenfreude for all targets, but especially the outgroup ones. Now, just to give you a little bit of some context for this difference. So if you were to take someone with the lowest levels of SDO and the highest levels of SDO and assess their difference in the amount of schadenfreude felt towards white in-group members, that difference is about an 8 on a 100-point slider. That difference jumps to 27 points for Black targets. And this is, again, on a 100-point slider. So people are moving almost or more than a fourth of the scale for people low in SDO and high in SDO for things like George stubbed his toe. So study 1 provides some evidence that when group membership is primed, social dominants show or feel decreased empathy and increased schadenfreude towards outgroup targets. But there's one obvious problem with this study, right? Is that it's not experimental. So although I found some interesting differences that seem to suggest that some sort of threat, perceived group threat, or maybe competition matters for counter empathy, I didn't experimentally manipulate anything. And that's what we wanted to do in study 2. So we want to experimentally test the importance of competition as well as generalize these patterns outside of race. So participants in this study, again, MTurk participants went through a very similar setup, but instead of race, we used a novel groups paradigm in which we randomly assigned people to one of 2 groups. So participants, if you know any of Mina's work, this setup will be very familiar to you. But participants were randomly assigned to be a member of an Eagle or the Eagles or the Rattlers based on a bogus personality test. So this is why it's a novel groups paradigm and not a minimal groups paradigm. So although group membership was randomly assigned, participants didn't know that. So these groups felt like they had some real world basis to them. And so outside of randomly assigning them to a group, we also manipulated the functional relationship between the Eagles and the Rattlers. So for some participants, these groups were competing for a prize at the end of the task, while for other participants, these 2 groups were cooperating for a prize. Now, before they got to the actual task where they were competing and cooperating, we said, hey, we just want you to get to know your team members and your opponent. And so they then did the state empathy task. Just as an FYI, this was not the task that they were competing or cooperating on. This was just a get to know you task before that, but this is the main point of the study. So very similar to the previous study, although in this case, there's no faces. So the groups are just represented by pictures of either an eagle or a rattler. So if you are an eagle and we are eagles, this is an outgroup trial in which we're assessing levels of negative empathy and schadenfreude. Okay, so data analysis was the same as all the previous studies, but now we have a between subjects design where people were randomly assigned to competition or cooperation. And the targets here are not white, Black, and Asian men, but now in-groups and outgroups. Now, you also might be wondering, we did control for in-group identification. As I've said before, in-group identification does matter for these processes, but we're really trying to isolate the effect of SDO here specifically. Same hypothesis as before, but with one additional one. So now we expect that SDO would only predict reduced empathy and increased counter empathy when groups are competing rather than cooperating. So what do we find? So now for this study, the lines here don't represent the relationship between SDO and an emotion for races, but now whether or not the target is an in-group target or an out-group target. If we just look at empathy, what you can see here is that as SDO increased, participants are actually now feeling more empathy for in-group member targets and less empathy for out-group targets, excuse me. So in the previous study where we had white participants, SDO just wasn't related to in-group empathy, but here, now SDO is actually positively related to in-group empathy, suggesting that SDO is not really, only related to like negative stuff. It's not that people with high levels of SDO just want to be nasty in general. It seems like they're targeting their emotions to the targets that make the most sense to, again, solidify hierarchy. Now, that is a hypothesis that I have. I have some evidence to show that it's motivated more directly, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. You can ask me later. Okay, now if we look at counter empathy, we can see that SDO correlates with increased counter empathy only for outgroup targets, as now is unrelated to counter empathy for in-group members targets, which is also different than study one. In study one, SDO was related to both types of counter empathy for all targets, including the in-group ones. Now here, SDO is not related to these emotions for in-group targets at all. Now, what I want you to do is to keep this pattern in mind, because what we're going to do is split by the group relationship. So I want you to, like, I don't know, keep your eyes open for a lot and then like blink and then open them back up. So do we see a similar pattern when the groups are competing versus cooperating? Now, the answer is yes for competition. So SDO related to increased empathy for the in-group and decreased positive empathy, at least for the out-group. SDO did not relate to counter empathy for the in-group, but did correlate with more counter empathy towards the out-group when groups were competing. However, when groups were cooperating, SDO actually didn't relate to empathy or counter empathy for in-group or out-group targets. You know, there was one exception, which was SDO's relationship with negative empathy for the out-groups. But on the whole, SDO just wasn't really tracking these emotions when groups were cooperating, but SDO was tracking these emotions when when these groups were competing. Okay. So if we sum up these two studies, when threat is activated or when groups are competing, social dominance showed decreased empathy and increased schadenfreude towards outgroup targets. Now, going back to my model, I just showed some evidence that SDO is related to these emotions in the way that we would predict. Now, these feelings matter because reduced empathy and increased counter empathy towards outgroup targets likely facilitate hierarchy maintenance by reducing outgroup help and increasing outgroup harm. So in the last study that I want to present to you, I'm actually going to move out of the realm of in-group and outgroup and now look at low status groups, but I actually think that the processes are very similar as it relates to SDO, because SDO is all about hierarchies, which can work for in-group and outgroup, as well as for high and low status groups. So let's simplify this just a bit. So what are the current pieces on the table, right? So we have SDO, we have these emotions, and we have these behaviors that, you know, help outgroups or help low status groups, harm low status groups, but on the whole, you can think about them as hierarchy enhancing behaviors. Now, decades of work has shown that SDO positively predicts engagement of hierarchy enhancing behaviors. And so what we're proposing is that feelings of empathy and counter empathy mediate this relationship, such that SDO predicts feelings reduce empathy and increase counter empathy towards low status groups. And from there, these emotions then predict engagement with these types of behaviors and support for policies that uphold hierarchy. Now, as the larger model suggests, we can think about these hierarchy enhancing behaviors as one of two types. So we're making a distinction between outcomes that actually passively harm marginalized groups through acts of omission, disinterest, and neglect. You know, if you take outgroup help, it's not helping is a form of passive harm, versus outcomes that deliberately harm such groups through acts of commission, active hate, and subjugation. And I think this just makes a ton of sense. If a particular group is being oppressed, I can actively engage in that oppression, or I can stand by and sort of be a passive bystander. But at the end of the day, there's still group oppression happening. So the harm is still being enacted. And so we think this distinction matters because empathy and counter empathy likely relate to different forms of harm. And so empathy, we are proposing, is the real mediator between SDO and passive harm, while counter empathy is the mediator between SDO and active harm. And that's what we're going to do in this final study. And then I'm going to stop talking because I would like to hear what everyone has to say. So like I said, in this final study, we're looking at these relationships. So in this study, what we did was assess participants' feelings of empathy and schadenfreude towards one of three social groups in America. So LGBT people, poor people, and undocumented immigrants. And we chose these targets or these groups because they're relatively low status in America, and it allows us to assess generalizability of our findings because they differ in the ways in which they're low status. So if participants were assigned to answer questions about poor individuals, they first read accurate information about the group that defined the groups and mentions the hardship that they face. So someone is poor, at least in America, for those who make less than the official poverty threshold, et cetera, et cetera. And we talked about, people who live in poverty suffer from these types of social ailments. Now, immediately after, we assessed empathy and counter empathy using a 1 to 5 scale. That's now a composite. So empathy was measured by asking how bad, sad, sympathetic, compassionate, and concerned do the circumstances of poor people make you feel, while schadenfreude was measured by asking how good, relieved, happy, and satisfied do the circumstances of poor people in America make you feel? And this was the same sort of setup as for LGBT, people and undocumented immigrants. So after participants indicated their empathic emotions, they then indicated their support for harmful and helpful policies towards the group in question, and then we end it with SDO. So we're operationalizing active harm by support for explicitly harmful policies, while a lack of support for explicitly helpful policies is our operationalization of passive harm. So we assess support for harmful policies by using what is called the Posse scale. The Posse scale to me is very wild. It's designed to capture the extent to which people are willing to engage in increasingly extreme behaviors to harm or marginalized groups. So for example, in the case of LGBT people, participants were asked to imagine that the American government outlawed same-sex marriage. And we did the study under Trump, so it was a possibility. And so participants indicated the extent to which increasingly extreme behaviors was true of them. Things like they would tell their friends that it was a good law, to that they would support the execution of gay or lesbian people that broke the law. I would say that that's active harm. Participants assigned to poor people were asked to imagine that the United States government made it mandatory for everyone over the age of 18 to have a job, while for people in the undocumented immigrants condition, imagine the American government banned immigration. So for helpful policies, what we did was operationalize it as support for explicitly helpful policies. So this contained between 6 and 7 items that capture the extent that people supported policies directed at improving the lives of the targeted groups. So we actually took policies from isidewith.com to assess support for policies that are currently in the public discourse. So in the case of undocumented immigrants, participants indicated the extent to which they were opposed to these immigrants having access to healthcare, or that they should qualify for in-state tuition rates. And just a sample item from the other groups included, gay people should have the same adoption rights as straight couples, or gay couples, and poor people should not be forced to work in order to qualify for healthcare. So I had several hypotheses regarding this model, but I really want to focus on the main one, which is that empathy and schadenfreude would mediate the relationship between SDO and these policy support in a very specific way. That the lack of empathy would be a stronger mediator for helpful policies, while schadenfreude would be a stronger mediator for harmful policies. To answer this question, what we did was ran 6 parallel mediation models such that empathy and schadenfreude mediated the relationship between SDO and these policy scale items separately. So I calculated our estimates using 5,000 bootstrap samples, and here I'm going to report the unstandardized regression coefficients. So to test the comparative strength of the indirect effects through empathy and schadenfreude, what I did was I bootstrapped the difference between the absolute value of the effects, because I'm not interested in the fact that they go in opposite directions. And so if I didn't use the absolute value, I would almost always find a difference, but it's not going to tell me about the strength of that difference. So in line with predictions, if we're looking at the relationship between SDO and harmful policy support for the poor, we find that the relationship between SDO and harmful policy support was mediated through schadenfreude, but not at all through empathy. And the indirect pathway through schadenfreude was significantly stronger than the indirect pathway through empathy. In contrast, the relationship between SDO and support for helpful policies for the poor was mediated both through empathy and schadenfreude, actually at equal strength. And if you account for these mediation pathways, the relationship between SDO and support for helpful policies didn't really change. That's because these mediation pathways are exerting equal but opposite forces. And so we replicated these mediation analyses exactly in a follow-up study. Schadenfreude was again the stronger mediator for harmful policy support compared to empathy. And in terms of helpful policy support, they were at equal strength. Now, I'm not trying to overwhelm you with a whole bunch of mediation models. So what I did was just sum them all up in a table. So we found support for our hypotheses for 4 out of 6 mediation models or mediation analyses. So more specifically, the results for undocumented immigrants exactly match hypotheses for both active and passive harm, while the results for poor, as I just showed you, differed for passive harm, while both empathy and schadenfreude were equally as strong as a mediator. Now, interestingly, for LGBT targets, schadenfreude was not the strongest mediator for active harm, and that's in part because SDO didn't really relate to levels of schadenfreude towards LGBT targets, and that is a question for future research. Okay, so now let me conclude, because I realized that was a lot. And so thank you so much for sticking with me through that talk. And so in 2018, Adam Sewer, who's a writer for The Atlantic, wrote an article entitled "The Cruelty is the Point," offering the position that some of the nasty partisan behavior seen in American politics is motivated by the actual delight in the suffering of others. Although he was writing specifically about politics, the idea that cruelty towards other groups can facilitate violence is a more general one. So across the world, I think there's been a resurgence of increasingly rigid beliefs about us versus them, fueled by perceived threat, leading to intensified intergroup animosity. And these are the exact conditions under which, antipathy and schadenfreude thrive, making sort of this work on what is going on with intergroup harm and what is the role of schadenfreude particularly timely to study. And so the model that I predicted or presented today is one way to understand the psychological processes that contribute to intergroup conflict. And so in the dissertation research that I just overviewed, I narrowed on the interplay between SDO, empathy, and counter-empathy. And what we found was that in situations of heightened competition, SDO's relationship with empathy and counter-empathy becomes stronger, specifically for outgroup targets, and feeling these emotions has consequences as they mediate the relationship between SDO and harmful policy support. And so clearly there is much more to do for this model outside of testing every single link possible. What I'm really interested in doing is focusing on behavior. So is policy support sort of qualitatively different from actually engaging in intergroup harm? I think it is, so I should study it. I'm also interested in sort of the cyclical and longitudinal nature of these processes. So I might feel, an emotion, for example, in response to police violence, but that happens often. So how do these things sort of reinforce each other over time? And then finally, I would like to look at different operationalizations of empathy and threat. Specifically as it relates to SDO, I want to expand to include the subscales of SDO. If you know anything about SDO, there's actually two subscales, one that's, anti-egalitarian and the other one that is really about dominance. And so it seems like, the dominant subscale is really connected to counter-empathy. The anti-egalitarian subscale is really connected to a lack of empathy, but I need to test that a little more directly, as well as expand into other ideologies such as political orientation, right-wing authoritarianism, and belief in a just world. Okay, and with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting. We've got a few comments in the Q&A, and I've also got a few, if we have time, that I'd love to ask you about. So first, a question from Jesse Sun. Do you propose any individual differences that might moderate the path between perceived group threat and empathy or schadenfreude, respectfully? So I think this was on when you were presenting the model originally.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, well, one, there are personality correlates that lead to differences in SDO. And I think, openness to experience is probably a big one. I should also say that there are probably people who perceive a threat. The question is, what do you do with that threat? And so it could be that there are some people who see the threat as a threat. There are other people that see the threat as a challenge, or people who don't have good emotion regulation strategies. And so I can imagine that a lot of the individual differences that sort of predict whether or not someone is going to sort of successfully regulate their emotions would sort of, moderate that relationship. I'm thinking also about this idea of, okay, I feel threatened. Can I affirm myself? And so if I can affirm myself, yes, I might feel threat, but I might not feel the downstream consequences, or I might not feel them as strongly as someone who feels threatened and can't really do anything about it. I should say, though, that unlike empathy, schadenfreude actually helps you regulate your emotions. So by you feeling schadenfreude in response to another person's misfortune, that actually does make you feel better. So in the case of schadenfreude, it's kind of like a weird catch-22. It's like, yes, we don't want you to feel it, but also by you feeling it, that actually might make you feel better. But then the question is, if you're feeling these emotions and it feels good, so there's some work showing that feeling schadenfreude can activate the same sort of reward circuitry in the brain, does that then make you go out and continue to do harm? Because you're like, I kind of like this as a strategy of making you feel better in situations of conflict. I don't know, but someone should say that.
Thank you. That's, again, really interesting. Next, we've got Roger Ginsarola, who's asking, can intergroup schadenfreude punch upwards in the social hierarchy? And if so, might SDO work against it in those instances?
Yes. So there is some work by Lucas and Kataili where they find that SDO is positively related to empathy for high status targets. So they find that like SDO predicts increased empathy for like CEOs compared to the janitor in the same company. I've done a little bit of work trying to look at this in the case of the stereotype content model, asking, is there a difference in the relationship between SDO and these emotions for like investment bankers and venture capitalists versus like homeless people and drug addicts? What I find there is that the warmth dimension of stereotype content model does not matter. It's all about the competence dimension. And there, I find that essentially SDO just really likes to punch down. It seems that, SEO, in terms of its relationship to these emotions, much stronger for the discussed targets than for the high status investment bankers and venture capitalists. Although definitely some more work needs to be done there. But I think that that's also kind of the cool part, right? Because according to the stereotype content model, we actually direct most of our schadenfreude towards the quadrant, the envy quadrant, the quadrant of low warmth and high competence. But at least for me, that is actually where the relationship between SEO and schadenfreude becomes attenuated. People are like, well, that's not really the targets that I want to express schadenfreude towards as a function of SDO. So I do think there's some interesting work that needs to be done on punching up. And I also wonder whether or not it's not SDO that might be the interesting thing as much as like either system justification or right-wing authoritarianism. I'm just thinking about people who might use schadenfreude as a way of justifying what's going on without having to do anything. So I think about, how much schadenfreude people feel when celebrities fall. It's like, yep, if you are up top and that's, you're not doing anything bad, I'm fine with that. But sometimes the vitriol against people who like slip up just a little bit is kind of wild to me. And I think that could be, again, because schadenfreude makes you feel better, it could be a way of keeping the world justified without having to necessarily change your behavior or without having to do anything. Just a thought.
Great, thank you. Next, we've got Arathi, who's first thanking you for this. And they ask, do you think other political or social constructs, for example, perceptions of group norms, might affect intergroup empathy? So I guess you've talked a lot about SDO, but do you think there's any other things as well that you might find particularly interesting or fruitful?
All the things. So yeah, so this model, this is why I say, I'm trying to make it a useful model. It's missing a whole bunch of stuff. Yes. But I actually would put group norms not quite as like an individual difference, but I would put it as a context. There are certain contexts in which the norms are, like, I think about sports games. It is perfectly fine for you to express schadenfreude at, the losing team. Actually, you'd be a bad sports fan in some ways if you weren't like, haha, that's what you get. I think Trump might have engendered a context where it was a little more okay to express schadenfreude towards low status targets, outgroup targets, et cetera. That to me is a contextual factor more so than an individual difference factor. And I think that matters. And I'm just trying to, I could definitely put it there, but now I'm trying to think, to what extent does group norms sort of match on to some of the other things that I mentioned, like unstable hierarchies, dynamic group size. And I think a lot of these things I should say are related, right? So I might feel more competition in dynamics where the hierarchy is unstable. And in those situations, group norms break down. And I actually think that the political landscape in America was a great example of that. I didn't realize how many things were not codified nowhere. They were just democratic norms that completely went out the window under Trump. And it's like, oh, but that's also a situation where people felt a lot more animus, competition, threat, et cetera, et cetera. And so then the norms go out the window. So I definitely think that group norms is a big part. I think of, Betsy Levy-Pollock's work. I just haven't necessarily studied it, but I do think it's interesting to think about the dynamics in which schadenfreude is okay to express versus a lack of empathy is okay to express. And I'm thinking of, the dynamics in New York City where they say like New Yorkers are not nice, but they're kind. And so, I've been thinking a lot about that. Like, does that mean that they don't have empathy, or they do, but it's just, no, I'm gonna be pro-social to you, but I'm not gonna smile at you. I'm just gonna yank up your suitcase and carry it up 5 flights of stairs. So, I do think that the norms argument, or the norms idea, is really fascinating. And there just has to be a lot more work on it.
Great, thank you. And now Crystal is asking, how do you think about feeling a congruent emotion with those who are themselves acting out group-based dominance? For example, those involved in the attack on the Capitol, and more broadly, does it matter if a group's grievances are valid?
A great question. I mean, for emotions, I don't think it matters if it's valid. Not to say that emotions are not based on reason, because they are, but I think you can feel an emotion even if you don't want to. Or like, I think about, there's a little bit of schadenfreude when people walk into a glass wall, but it's like ambivalent schadenfreude. I feel a lot of empathy, but I'm also like, that was funny. Like, I do feel just a little bit of joy in you, feeling, or you doing that, but I don't want to. So, in that case, I don't know if the validity of the emotion matters, but it kind of goes back to the question around social norms, because that to me is like where the validity, it's like a crowdsourcing validity. The people, if you think about all these like bubbles that people are existing in, they are existing in bubbles where everyone's like, no, you should be outraged. No, you should feel schadenfreude. No, you should feel empathy. And I do think that the congruent emotion part is valid, whether or not like what the person is reacting to. So in the case of the Capitol riot, I mean, there were some people who I don't want to call them riots, because that apparently is partisan. I'm not supposed to be partisan. I'm on a job market. I'm not partisan. Yay. The protesters, there's some people who let the protesters in. That they were like, either I'm not really going to worry about them, or there are some people who took photos with the protesters. I bet in that case, they were probably feeling empathy towards their cause. It's like, yeah, you are really out here, really fighting a man. Like, I'm going to support you in that way. They were feeling a congruent emotional reaction, I would argue. So I don't know, there's a lot here. The thing your question also makes me wonder is what happens when the person that you are reacting to doesn't feel the emotion that you think that they are. So for example, and I think, this kind of goes to Fiery's like action versus outcome dynamic. If you have someone who is, I don't know, a quadriplegic, and they get stabbed in the leg, they don't feel it. So, me simulating empathy for them, it's like, well, what am I simulating? Because I actually know that they don't feel it. And that's like a very extreme example, but I think at the end of the day, does it require sort of the other person or the other group to actually experience the emotion that we are simulating in order for this to happen? And that also might be one way that intergroup conflict sort of gets maintained. So I think about some of the responses to like Asian American hate in America. Well, part of a stereotype about Asian Americans is that they're not very emotional. So does that mean it's maybe harder for people to simulate the empathy that they feel towards these groups? And so that is actually leading to fewer pro-social behaviors? Like, I'm not 100% sure. Whereas in the case of Black Americans, I think a lot of emotions get felt, very heightened emotions. And so it's, a little more chaotic. I don't know, but if you think about what's actually happening from the actual misfortune standpoint, some of these things are exactly equivalent, yet the emotional reactions and then subsequent, like what people are doing about them, are very different. So things I want to study, I have not gotten there yet. That's a really great question.
Great, thank you. I've got a question that is maybe a bit of not a terribly well-informed question, but I'm going to go with it anyway because I'm interested in the answer. So we talk a lot about intersectionality recently, and I think originally the focus was mostly on the experience of discrimination for the person experiencing the prejudice and how that can feel different. But obviously this can also then, people exist and have multiple different identities. And I was wondering with your model, if you've looked at or how you might think when there are different groups, how that would plug in. Like, would it be that it's just like double the counter empathy if it's two marginalized groups? What if it's like groups that may be stereotyped as going together, like poor versus Black versus, I don't know, like, I don't know, it's something else, like I'm trying to think of incongruent marginalized groups, which maybe isn't even a concept that makes sense. But do you know what I mean? Like, how will this affect with these different groups, with people with different identities?
I mean, you already know, I think that's a phenomenal question because I study intersectionality. I do think that so you have intersectionality from like the experience and the perception, or, you know, I can target you because you're an intersectional target. I can experience the world differently because we're all intersectional targets. In some ways, that's a silly way of thinking about it. But I think your idea of what happens when you have two identities conflicting in some ways with one another or amplifying one another is a really interesting thing to think about. And there's a recent model that's come out with Erica Hall and her colleagues on the Mosaic model, trying to find situations in which you get amplification or attenuation of stereotypes and responses based on two identities. So I'm thinking, for example, that like, you know, you hear like, what's the best face of like police violence sometimes, you know, like, or like, what is a good victim? Like, when will you ever get a situation in which things won't happen, you know, you won't get a ton of backlash? And oftentimes people go into intersectional targets. They're like, well, maybe if it's a child, but we know that Black individuals tend to not be seen as children more so. So some of these things clearly are either amplifying one another or muting one another, making it harder for some of these processes, I think, to work. I think about Black women, for example, and how there have been victims of police brutality that have been Black women. A lot of people don't either know about them, and in some ways they were perfect victims. And I'm putting perfect really in quotes, but I think about, you know, Breonna Taylor. She literally didn't do anything. She was sitting at home, like it was a warrant that went wrong, all these things. And not a lot of change necessarily happened. And I think in part because you might think, well, she's Black, and so that leads people to, you know, not care as much, but she's also a woman. So wouldn't that then maybe lead to, you know, more care? But also part of the care that surrounds sexism, you know, like the benevolent part of sexism requires an interdependency between men and women. Is there an interdependency between Black women and the forces at large? Probably not. That breaks that connection. So now you have someone who's not stereotypically Black. So they're not necessarily, I don't know, receiving the same backlash, but they're not necessarily getting a boost from their gender, kind of ended up in like a situation. And I think that that's actually what's happening. So, you know, some of this will be idiosyncratic, but I think there's a lot of like underlying dynamics that probably need to be added on top of the model to really understand under what circumstances and for what targets do you get amplification of this lack of empathy, increased schadenfreude, or maybe like a reversal of it. Like, I think this was Roger's point that, you know, SEO probably leads to higher levels of empathy towards some targets. So you're either getting, you know, amplification or reversals, but then I think there might be some situations in which none of this works. And that, you know, thinking about LGBT people, it just doesn't seem like the reasons why people are aggressing or against LGBT people as a function of SEO is related to schadenfreude. It's just a lack of empathy. Now, a lack of empathy can still get you to maybe do a little bit of outgroup harm, but it really seems like, well, we just don't want to help you. No, we don't want you to have rights. Some people aggress, but I think that aggression might be more of a right-wing authoritarianism argument rather than an SEO argument. So I say, let's say, super complicated. And I'm interested in the complexities. Like, I love complex models, but I haven't really sat down and modeled all of it because I'm really am pulling from a whole bunch of different dynamics, trying to figure out, like, yes, there's a lot of idiosyncrasies with intersectionality, and there should be, because people's experiences are different histories, different like dynamics, but are there some commonalities? I think that there are. And what does that mean if we can like actually say them out in typologize? I don't know the right word. That.
Thank you so much. I mean, unfortunately, we're out of time now. That's our hour gone. But this was such a fascinating talk. Really, really great model. So much to think about. So thanks so much for taking the time to give this talk, especially as you mentioned, you're on the job market. I'm sure you've got an awful lot to be doing. So thanks for participating in this. Thanks to everyone for coming. Yeah, this was super interesting. There's a lot to think about.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. This was fun.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I'll see most of you in 3 weeks when we've got Paulo Boggio from Brazil coming to talk to us. I am not sure exactly what, but it will be something moral psychology, I imagine. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely day, evening, night, wherever you are. Bye.